Thank you very much, Diane. This has been a fascinating experience, at least for me, and I've learned a lot. And I want to share with you some of the ideas that came out of this group on risk and uncertainty. I'm going to be talking particularly about three papers, one by Dejan about investment derisking and uncertainty, about a paper that written by Jose Manuel Vasallo about separating the funding of a PPP from the charging from user charging and making that work through a road fund or infrastructure fund. And then last, a paper that I wrote with my two co-authors, Eduardo Engel and Ronnie Fisher, about how to deal with the obsolescence of transport infrastructure in PPP contracts, motivated by the changes or the large technological changes that are anticipated to occur in the next decades on how we will move ourselves around. I will summarize things in 6 ideas. Don't expect pictures from me because you won't see them. That's a bias we have in academia. People don't like you to show pictures. That's why I suggest how boring we are. The first idea, but the conclusions, I don't think they are boring. For people interested in these topics, shouldn't be boring. The first idea is that private participation in transport infrastructure is modest. There is a financing problem in private transport infrastructure provision, a perceived problem. Many people blame it on risk. We should be aware that the starting point is modest. What I'm showing you there is total transport, rail and road spending in the OECD's 7 largest economies between 1995 and 15 actually, what you see there is that yearly spending is about between 80 and 100 billion. Private spending, which is the blue line at the bottom, is is a bit less than 10%. It depends on the year, but it's a bit less than 10%. So the gap, most spending in transport infrastructure is public in the traditional way. And that's the starting point. You can see that as reality, as an opportunity, or as a fact. You shouldn't expect a boom in that everything will become private, because it hasn't happened. And that's the same thing around the world. What I'm showing you there is data on world infrastructure spending, the average for 3 years, 2008, 9, and 10. Getting data on world infrastructure spending is really, really hard. But if you take the average year there, you see that about spending in transport infrastructure was about $1 trillion a year. PPPs were in transport were between 45 and 75 billion a year. Again, it's far less than 10%. So that's the situation in the world. The second idea is that PPPs have worked well in seaports and in airports, less so in roads and rail. In seaports and airports, which is about 20% of spending roughly 20% of spending in transport infrastructure, the Drury database shows that 257 landlord ports in 2014, and the database from the World Bank, PF, shows 141 PPPs in airports. And probably, maybe it's the reason, or maybe it's the reason, but maybe it's the cause, but at least it has happened together. It's probably part of the equilibrium. These are two sectors in which demand and usage has grown at very, very fast rates in the last 30 years, both in airline traffic, which has grown about 6 times in the last 30 years, 25 years, and container traffic in the world. And you can probably, that has something to do with the success of the model, but it also probably it's the right response to this huge increase in demand. It's a proof that it works. You accommodate it fairly easily or seamlessly, a huge increase in demand. If you go to roads, however, and rates on roads, the experience, which is about 80% of spending, the experience is far less clear. You have a lot of renegotiations all the time, which is seen as a problem. And in any case, you see a rather small percentage of spending is private, and then it's concentrated in a few countries. The third idea is that risk and insufficient funding are different problems. And I think this is a simple idea, but it's a fundamental idea which has been hammered through the working group sessions by Dejan. So I'm stealing, well, I'm supposed to present his ideas as well, so I'm not stealing them. So funding is who will pay for the project. It may be users through tolls, it may be taxpayers through the budget, or maybe a combination of both. And actually, Jose Manuel Vasallo's paper is about that. And I encourage you to read that because it's a very interesting proposal. But a funding problem is who will pay for the project. A risk is essentially unpredictable variation in total project value. It's variation in revenues minus costs. And you don't know which outcome will realize. But those two are different issues. If a project is not funded, so it has an expected value which is negative and fairly negative, then there's no way you're going to get financing for that, regardless of the risk. Risk becomes a problem after the project is funded. The fourth idea is that the key question about the risk is, can some party or a combination of the parties do something about a particular risk? If the answer is yes, we economists like to call that thing an endogenous risk. And that could be because if the concessionaire does a good job, it will attract more demand. That's usually the case in airports and in seaports. Or one concept that I think has been hammered in this working group, and it's a very, very interesting concept, which is usually not discussed in the way it has been discussed in the group, is derisking. That you invest and you spend to clarify what you're doing, and by doing that, you reduce the risk. You reduce the unpredictable variation in returns. And you reduce that in ways in which probably you won't find markets willing to take that risk. Because if you have to invest to know what you're doing, doing, then it means that anybody who wants to figure out what your risks are must do exactly the same thing. But that's not efficient. You should be doing it yourself. And I think this is, to me at least, is one of the most interesting concepts that has come out very clearly out of the discussions and especially out of the experience here. The questions, if you have an endogenous risk then, is who should be responsible for the risk, and what do you get in exchange for that party bearing the risk? Do you get better risk management? And that should be done risk by risk in a very detailed way. If the answer to the question, can somebody do something about the risk, is no, then we economists like to call that an exogenous risk. And then it's essentially an insurance problem. The risk is there, and the key question there is who should sell insurance to whom? And if you say, for example, the private firm should take the risk, what you're saying actually is the private party should sell you insurance. And then that's a very interesting question to make, because it immediately puts the problem in perspective. Why should you be the better insurer in this case? The fifth idea, I think it's a conclusion that comes very strongly out of this group, is that thoughtful risk allocation is a de-risking strategy by itself. If you do careful risk allocation and you think carefully about risks, then risks will be smaller. Most of the risks that, and if you do it, if you do it thoroughly, most of the risks in the end will be business risks, and that's exactly what the private sector wants. It wants risks that are inherent to the business, but not to the regulator, to the fact that you don't know what you're doing, and so on. Let me give you now an example with demand risk. Think of seaports and roads. In seaports, the quality and speed of service can affect demand for the port dramatically. A shipper won't be very patient with your incompetence. It will decide that your port is simply too expensive, not because you're charging too much, but because sitting there for a long while, it's simply too costly in terms of capital. Actually, if you do back of the envelope calculations, you get that those costs can be an order of magnitude larger than the cost of paying to the port. So an incompetent port essentially kills the demand. So it's probably a very good idea to have the operator of the terminal bear that demand risk, because then the operator has all the incentives to get. And probably you would like that operator to have an attractive margin, because you want the operator to be hurt by incompetence or sloth. Roads, on the other hand, risks are largely exogenous, and once the road is available, the demand is largely exogenous, and the question there is, should the government buy or sell insurance? Now, before getting to the rest of the presentation, which is about 3 minutes more, let me make a clarification. It's not that demand risk in seaports is in some fundamental and physical way endogenous and in roads exogenous. It depends on the case by case. I'm trying to make a generalization so that we can go forward. But again, there's no substitute to go project by project in this thinking. Let me go into demand risk, in exogenous demand risk. What I'm showing you there is a very simple example. Let's assume that we have a road that costs $600 to build, and let's assume that the cash flows that this road can generate are what you're seeing there. Either the road generates $100 each year in cash flow, net cash flow, or it generates $50. In expected value, it generates $75. Now, if you do a fixed term PPP, you are, in some sense, you are creating risk. You let that concession run for 8 years. If the demand turned out to be large, then the concessionaire will make 200 of profits, 800 in revenues minus 200 minus 600 in costs. If it turns out to be a low demand road, then it will lose $200. If you do a fixed term, you create risk, because if you look at the whites in the table, which are from year 9, 10, 12, it's pretty clear that this road is funded. There are enough cash flows here. It's just a matter of whether you sign a contract, which means that in a fixed amount of time, whether you'll get that or not. Now, you have a lot of options here, and José Manuel Vasallo's paper actually exploits those options to claim and argue compellingly, in my opinion, that you can separate the cash flows from the infrastructure from the fund, from the payments to the concessionaire, and you have a lot of flexibility to do that. You have one option. It's hard to think, by the way, that in a road PPP, that the PPP should bear the demand risk, because it's hard to think that PPP investors are in the insurance business. They can go to the capital market, but the capital markets are not, like we economists like to think, perfect, and that Modigliani-Miller applies, and that you can have complete markets for everything. Capital markets do some risks, and most risks they don't do because it's too expensive to evaluate them and know what you're doing. On the other hand, the government can spread risks among taxpayers. That's not a free lunch, of course. That's something that should be used with prudence, but nonetheless is a fact. So you have that option. Private infrastructure, there is also a compelling argument in this. When you look at private infrastructure, say, for example, LNG terminals or pipelines, usually the contracts are take or pay. You build the infrastructure, I will do that, but you pay me take or pay. And you bear the demand risk. You, the guy who wants to move the gas there, you will pay for that risk, and you will bear that risk. And second and last, the experience is that there are lots of renegotiations because demand was too low. And that's probably not a good idea to have. What options do you have? Actually, you have many. One is an availability contract. Recall this road that costs $600. You could make the concession run for 8 years and pay the concessionaire $75 each year, then take the demand risk off the concessionaire's shoulders, and the government would bear, or the state would bear the risk. You can make a lease present value of revenue contract in which you run the concession for 6 years. If you run the concession until it generates enough $600 of revenue. In the high demand state, that would be 6 years. In the low demand state, that would be only 12 years. In this case, of course, the government is bearing the demand risk. The sixth idea, the idea 6, is that the government has. There's one more, I think, compelling argument in favor of governments bearing demand risk, which in the case of exogenous risks, which is that the government has far more and better options if the road PPP doesn't bear demand risk. Once you separate demand risk from the remuneration of the concessionaire, essentially what you get, you have to convince the concessionaire to pay the cost of the project and guarantee enough revenues that this will happen, enough payments that this will happen. So the business of the concessionaire is not forecasting demand anymore, but rather be very careful with the cost of the project. And that opens a lot of opportunities of doing things that give the government more flexibility to do other good things. First, you can write buyout clauses that are far easier to write because the compensation to buy back should be the total amount of revenue that the concessionaire asked minus what revenue it has already gotten. That's not completely easy to do, but it's far more feasible than estimate, if I terminate the concession today, how many more cars would have been through here and how many tolls would you have gotten. There is an option then to revamp the infrastructure. For example, in my country, concessions are already 25 years old, and by now they should be massively revamped. And probably you would like to do that sooner than later, and you wouldn't like to wait until the concessions run out. But they are fixed terms, so there is an issue there, how much you pay the concessionaire. If you know how much you would have to pay, then it will be far easier. You can handle obsolescence risk, and of course, you can separate tolling and funding of PPPs. And then I encourage you to read José Manuel Vasallo's paper to learn the things that you can do with that. Thank you.